March 8th of 2020. We had worship in the building. Pastor Tim from Oakton was here and preached that Sunday about service and mutual aid, that it was less about being a generous savior to others and more just about me knowing you, you knowing me, and then we would know each other's needs and be moved to assist and serve where we could. I preached in Nokesville that day. My message you've all heard since about Matthew 18, how if you have an issue with someone, you should talk to that person directly, one-on-one. I think I might just preach that message once a year for the rest of my career. The next day, Monday, March 9th, I spent the day researching and writing a summary about this novel coronavirus increasingly taking over the news cycle, or trying to write. It took me most of the day because every time I thought I was done, I'd hit refresh on my browser and there would be new articles online with new information and changing information. Do you all remember how that was? Those early days when information and news was breaking quicker than our ability to keep up with it. It was that Wednesday night, Thursday morning when we learned the NBA ended their season early. And that Friday when the board emailed around and voted to suspend in-person worship services. 2 weeks to save the world. Remember that? Well, first it was a couple weeks, then it was a couple months, and people slowly and then quickly began realizing that this thing was going to be with us for a while. As more and more people got sick and more people started dying, we thought we were going to have a rough time because of COVID, but it was at least one shared and unique experience. Until May 25th, when for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, George Floyd was choked to death. Recorded by Darnella Frazier, all of 17 years old, who had the wherewithal to pull out her phone so that the world could see. And they did. And we did. Another significant event of last year. Don't worry, this will be the last one we review from 2020. September 18th, Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away. This feels like a significant event in last year, not just because of the significance of her life or the grief in her passing, but because by the end of the night, it was already announced that the current administration would be replacing her. They waited maybe 3 hours after the news of her passing to announce that. It sort of captures my experience of last year for me, that we were barely allowed time to grieve. We had just, in fact, gotten sort of one breath of grief in, and the next news cycle starts. News of her eventual replacement and how quickly our grief was given space for anger and other emotions. See, that's the thing about last year that was so striking for me. We had this sort of box that we just kept adding more things to, this box labeled things we want to grieve, things we need to process. I don't have the time or the capacity for that right now because I need to keep functioning. So here it goes in this box. Last year was so tough. Do you remember? Do you remember when we hoped 2021 would be different for like 5 days? Remember that? Yeah, and then January 6th. I promised you we were done with 2020, but one event from this year. January 6th, whatever word you prefer to use for the events of that day. But the options include words like attempted insurrection, coup, terrorism, however you put it. It happened just 8 miles from here. You know, I first thought when it happened, I'm going to be totally honest with you all. My first thought when I saw that news, I thought, I don't have time for this today. So I was very busy that day, that week. I knew I had to keep moving forward, and I didn't think I had the capacity to process something new, to process something as significant as that event. But I found the space, because that's what life has asked of us this last year plus, and asked of some people for much longer than that. Just keep moving on. Process some things, like 5 or 10%, and then place them in that box. That box over there, the box labeled things we want to grieve, things we need to process, but you don't have the time or the capacity right now. So just keep functioning and place it in that box. This is why I thought the lectionary text was so salient for this morning. Mark chapter 6 is such a fascinating chapter. It begins with Jesus sending the disciples out to minister on their own. They return in verse 30, as we heard earlier. The apostles returned to Jesus and told him everything they had done and taught. But many people were coming and going, so there was not even time to eat. So Jesus says to the disciples, the disciples were trying to debrief and process it all, but they couldn't, because the pace of life continued so quickly. So then Jesus says in the second half of verse 31, Jesus says to the apostles, "Come by yourselves to a secluded place and rest for a while." They departed in a boat, verse 32, by themselves for a deserted place. This is fantastic advice. If you're tired, if you're overwhelmed, get away for a bit. Catch up. Rest. Process that stuff you put in that box. But right in verse 33, the very next verse, many people saw them leaving and recognized them. So they ran ahead from all the cities and arrived before them. When Jesus arrived and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. Then he began to teach them many things. Even the disciples' move for rest was dissuaded. They couldn't even rest when they needed to. And Jesus had the emotional space to feel compassion and minister to the crowd. But the disciples were not Jesus, and they were tired. And we are not Jesus either, and we are tired. They needed space to refuel and recharge. And even in devoting themselves to taking time away, they still found it was hard to find that space. And I guess that's my message for this morning. Who here can relate to being tired? Who here can relate to how it feels when your bodies or your emotions, it's like you're moving through life like as in quicksand? Who here can relate to that box labeled, the things we want to grieve, things we need to process, but I didn't have the time or the capacity earlier, so now it's in this box, and it's still in this box now? In the 6th chapter of Mark, Jesus tells his disciples, go get some rest. But the demands of life and ministry wouldn't let them. And so when Jesus in the same chapter tells them to feed 5,000 people, They must have had two reactions. First of all, how? Seriously? How do we feed 5,000 people? If I had the energy, I wouldn't know how to do it. And then second of all, Jesus, we are tired. This item, which would always feel big, feels even bigger now. During annual conference, I was catching up with several friends on Zoom throughout conference, and this one in particular I was catching up with. And when it was my turn to share how I was doing, I did my best to be open and honest while also being relatively brief. It's like weird to catch up with friends you haven't talked to in 2 years. But I did my best, and then I asked how they were doing. And then they shared and shared and shared and shared about all of these events in this last year, things they had placed in that box of things to process later. But now it's a year later, and our boxes are full or overflowing. I guess that conversation is the inspiration for this morning's message, because I think that is universal. So to anyone who's relating, who's resonating to this message this morning, I have two things to say. First, you survived. You did it. You should feel proud. You got through. You got your family through. You got this community through. You are a survivor. So be proud of yourself. And second, maybe it's time to start wondering about what's in that box. Maybe it's time to start looking back and seeing what we may still need to process. All those things in our life from the last year, or even from a lifetime of living, all those things we said we'd process later, maybe it's later. Maybe it's time to start processing those things in our own heads, with friends, with people we might even pay to help us process. Please start finding spaces to process and go through the items in that box. Value your mental health. We need to do better than just assuming we're better now because enough time has passed. We need to actively open that box and make ourselves look inside of it. You might consider calling a deacon. I'd be honored if you called me your pastor. I don't care how. Another way I haven't even named. Just find a space for you to talk about those things we had to bury to keep moving forward. Well, the other lesson we draw from the text this morning for our lives is this: find space to rest. A quote I stumbled across this week from Josh Garrels: rest is a weapon against the oppression of a person's obsession to control things. Great quote. Rest is a weapon against oppression of controlling. It reminds me of a great social media account and ministry I follow called, you ready for this? The Nap Ministry. It's a true thing. Check it out online. The Nap Ministry is run by a Black woman who constantly reminds people that rest in of itself is an act of resistance and step towards justice. That social justice and loving others means taking time out of your life to be unproductive in the worldly sense of it, to be just whoever you are, to even rest. If you're on social media, you can check them out online, but maybe some of us need to log out of social media for a while. Turn off the news for a day here or there and just sit with your brain and your thoughts and rest and be. So we process our past and we rest where we can, knowing that we are not called to be perfect to minister to others, but that the model is one touted by Henry Nouwen and others called the wounded healer, the wounded healer. We are not called to be perfect before ministering to others, but we are called to be in touch with our wounds. And then still able, because of our addressing of our own needs, because of our space for rest, we're able then to once again re-engage with community and the larger culture and still be wounded, but then helping others. This vision of the priesthood of all believer ministry, then we live into the vision cast in this verse 56, that wherever Christ and the disciples go, everyone who reaches out and touches the Christ will be healed.